Thanks for having us on the Graph Show. I'm David Jones-Gilardi with the DataStax Developer Advocate Team, and I'm here with Lorina Poland, lead technical writer at DataStax. Interestingly, Lorina got into technical writing after 20 plus years of electrical engineering and 10 years of teaching high schoolers STEM topics, which that is a whole nother conversation on its own, I'm sure. So today, Lorina is going to bring a docs perspective when approaching Graph. Hello, Lorina.
Hey there, how you doing, David?
Doing all right. So I'm curious. I'd love for you to just kind of give us an idea of what, talk about the process of documenting, right? I have a feeling it's not really going to be what a lot of developers think it is. And I'm really curious to what you have to say on this.
Sure. So it was interesting to get into technical writing. It's actually something I've only been doing for the last few years. But it's really felt like a place that was home for me because it brought all the talents that I have to bear. I would say that about 80% of technical writing is actually testing and messing around with software, trying to figure out how it works so that you can have a good idea of what the experience that a user is actually going to have with the product. Okay. So I spend a lot of time writing code snippets and running tests that, are really similar to what, say, a QA person might do. And only about 15 to 20% of my time is actually spent writing once I figured that out.
So it's not, so what I heard there is then it's not just a process of, you're not just the doc writer person who gets like docs from the engineering team and just kind of like massages them and puts them in a format, that's nice for online publishing or for people to reference, but you actually have to get your hands dirty, get technical, understand the technology. Do you get into code, things like that?
I do. And actually, I oftentimes am somebody who uncovers bugs at the last minute before releases, which endears me to the engineers, of course. But yeah, some tech writers are different, but in especially new, sort of upcoming fields like this, really, I have to go back and look at the code and be sure that I understand what I'm doing and seeing. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go talk to an engineer unless I'm really stuck.
Okay.
So, and with Graph, that was really the case. Graph was, Graph's a pretty new area, especially at DataStax. We didn't really have a lot of people here who understood what it was, and so. Over the development of time in building the original Graph docs, it was quite a bit of experimentation.
Okay, so you mentioned when you were first explaining it, you mentioned something about testing, right? Is this more of where your team and yourself are actually sitting down, like performing manual tests, or is it like automated testing? Or are you doing anything with the code itself, or how does that part work?
So with the Graph documents, I finally sort of got my act together and started automating the testing to the extent that I could run scripts to test everything. Here, I actually found that I would write the code snippets that would be used in the documentation in sort of small snippets, but then paste them together to do an overall test. And it turns out that that documentation has the code snippets in the documentation coming directly from scripts that get run to test the code. So
that's cool.
That's an improvement over copying and pasting running code.
I see. Okay, so it sounds like overall it's actually a pretty technical job, right? It's a lot more technical than I think maybe folks would expect it could be. So, all right, with that, let's talk about, I'm going to move in and talk about some of the recent changes when documenting DS Graph 6.8. As I understand it, there are some special cases, or there were some special cases, right, when documenting DS Graph 6.8 compared to some of the earlier versions. Maybe give us some insight on what those are.
Sure. So originally, DataStax Graph was written, and it was based on work that was done on TitanDB. By a company called Aurelius, and the way that the data was stored. So in our case, when we started working with Graph, we were only storing data in Cassandra, Apache Cassandra tables, And those tables originally had an interesting, very graph-like flavor to them, where, for instance, the edges were only stored in relationship to the vertices. And so you had these tables that would remember which edges were attached to each vertex and what an adjacent vertex was to that. When DataStax Graph was redesigned, the tables became much more in line with the kind of tables that CQL was normally storing. And what that did is that it actually exposed the edges and the properties of the edges more directly than they had been before. So, but it was a sort of a shift in thinking about how the data was stored and how you could access it. And that actually allowed us now to access the data with both Gremlin, the language that Graph was originally written to interface with, as well as the Cassandra Query Language, CQL.
Oh, okay. So now was that just, it sounds like it was the way that the storage model had changed, right? That opened up that opportunity. Yes. Was that just some clever thinking as far as the documentation itself was, was concerned, or was it literally just opened it up now that the storage model was different and you're writing the data differently and you're accessing it differently? That just kind of opened this door up.
Well, I think the experience of the original graph sort of led the whole team, including myself, to understanding that the way that we were accessing the data was not as direct as it could be. And
I see.
I do know that I remember being part of conversations and actually making a suggestion along that line, and was very gratified when the engineers decided to explore that a little bit and see if a redesign would make it work a little bit better.
Okay. So now that actually gets me into the next thing I wanted to ask. Right? Was we were talking a little bit about the new DS Graph 6.8 and some of the differences in the storage model, and the fact that you can now work with DS Graph with CQL, right? But before that change, I would think a lot of the documentation that you were writing and the team was writing would have been CQL based. We're talking Apache Cassandra, right? So what's the difference though? If you think about it, we're kind of we're kind of crossing over Gremlin versus CQL.
Right.
And those are kind of two different beasts, right? So can you talk a little bit about the difference between documenting Gremlin compared to CQL?
Sure. So CQL was something I was really familiar with, and a lot of the readers of the documentation would be familiar with if they were coming from SQL type backgrounds. Gremlin's a little bit different. It's a chained language where basically you can build a chain of commands that are cumulative in what they'll do to the data that you're pulling back from the database. And that's a definite paradigm shift to think in that regards. And it's very easy to understand conceptually, but when you actually practically start trying to write commands to retrieve data with Gremlin, it can get pretty hairy pretty quickly. So in terms of the documentation, for instance, there are places in the documentation where I added some images, some diagrams that tried to illustrate what was going on with the data from step to step, just to make it clear how the whole data set was getting parsed down to what you got at the end.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. One of my favorite sites when I was first getting into Graph and Gremlin was SQL to Gremlin. Right. I can't remember if it's .com or .net, but it was one of my favorite sites to go to because it gave you this nice comparison. Now, mind you, it's SQL, not CQL, but CQL for all intents and purposes, right, is so similar to SQL that I think you can make the comparison generally.
Right. And in fact, it was really interesting when DataStax Graph 6.8 came along and we could access it fully with CQL. One of the things that I found as I was writing the documentation on that was that I had gotten so fully immersed in the Gremlin world that that it sort of was, messing with my mind, trying to write how to interact with it with CQL. Yeah. And you know, and then there was a third aspect, which was you could have CQL that you could just convert to graph with a few commands, right?
Right.
So so there were sort of all these different ways that you could work with it, and it also turned out that a lot of people work with Gremlin through the Gremlin console, which is a command line tool, versus working with it with the visual tool Studio. And again, that was one of the areas writing documentation I made sure to test. And sure enough, here and there we found bugs because of the way that the commands were being parsed in the console and
Right.
Studio were actually different because the back ends of both of those tools were different. So again, I got to file a couple of bugs that were pretty hairy things to fix, you know, about a week before general release.
You know, that's the best time to submit those bugs. It's about a week before GA. You know, from the developer advocate standpoint, we kind of do a lot of the same stuff from there, right? You know, we hit on things before when the engineering teams don't quite see it coming. And a lot of times it's pretty soon before release.
Yeah,
you know,
it's always a real hard push. I try to start working early and being a part of any team I'm writing for early on, so that I understand some of the issues that they're running into, or to make suggestions about how things can be changed. But on the other hand, I hate to start writing too early, because until I can actually get something I can test, you know, it's when you get to the point where you really can test things that you know what it is that you're going to need to document.
Absolutely. You can't, if you're too soon in the process, then you're going to be getting things when they're kind of half baked, right?
Yeah.
And that might be a little too soon.
Yeah, I've certainly had cases where I wrote pretty full documentation and then just had to trash it because, you know, things changed.
Yeah, I can totally see that. All right, so excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate you kind of giving us some insight on what it looks like to document with Gremlin Graph and DS Graph. Is there anything else that you would like our viewers to know before we close out?
Sure. Today? You know, documenters can only write what they know, and so they're always interested. We're always interested in your feedback and input about documents. And in the case of Graph, community.datastax.com is a good place to put any concerns that you have about the documentation. I pretty regularly go check that out to see if there's anything we can improve.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lorina, and thank you everybody for joining us on the Graph Show.
Thanks, David.